Hello, everyone. My name is Katlin Harris. I'm a doctoral candidate in musicology at the University of Illinois. Today, I am here with the newly minted Dr. Isaac Brinberg, who just passed his defense on, and I believe the topic was Chen Yi's music.
Yes.
Awesome. And Isaac is currently a finishing graduate assistant here in the wind band conducting program. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. Do you want to just talk about your dissertation for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak about my work and my dissertation and Dr. Chen's music. And she's someone I just really adore as a composer and as a musician. So I'm always excited to get to share what I've learned about her, what I'm continuing to learn about her and her music as well. So the topic of my thesis was her work By Yin, which is a work that was originally for saxophone quartet and chamber orchestra. It was commissioned by the Rascher Quartet and Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra back in 2001. And then in 2015, it was rescored for saxophone quartet and chamber winds percussion for the University of Missouri Kansas City Conservatory Wind Symphony. And then that premiere was given in 2015. So I studied primarily the version for saxophone quartet and chamber winds percussion as my general purview, but I also, as part of my thesis, did some comparative orchestration analysis between the two versions to see how studying the original version could inform interpretation for the winds percussion version. But essentially, my thesis looked at examining various background information about the folk music and the instruments that she uses as source material for each movement of this three-movement, basically saxophone concerto. And then also looking at form analysis, pitch and rhythmic analysis, like I said, comparative orchestration, then also some performer considerations, just some practical things for conductors and saxophone quartets as they take in all the information from an analytical perspective and translate that into performance practice.
Wow, that's fascinating. Didn't Chen Yi just had a residency at the University of Illinois, and they played
Yes.
By Yin, right?
Yes. So the residency was something that functioned more or less as my recital project, but it kind of wound up taking a life of its own.
Mm-hmm.
So back in the fall, I should say I've known Chen Yi for a few years now. I did my master's at the University of Missouri Kansas City Conservatory, so that's where I met her and her husband Joe Long when the bands have done her music while I was there, and they would come into rehearsals, and I'd get to see their work and their process with rehearsing their pieces. But then I also got to work with some of her students on their recitals, and I would, if they needed a conductor for one of their composition recitals on a premiere, then I was very lucky to do a few of those. So I got to interact with her in those environments as well. But back in the fall, I had the idea I wanted to see if she was available to come to campus because I wanted to do the piece in a performance and get her, at least in person, to be able to work with the performers and get some coaching, some insights on the piece as kind of part of a lecture recital. And we wound up finding the dates, making it work, and I was starting to look in some funding sources. And my advisor, Dr. Giraldi, recommended actually looking beyond the School of Music for funding. So I wound up reaching out to a professor in our Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here on campus, and she pointed me to her department chair. And I pitched the idea to the department chair, and we wound up Zooming, and her department has an endowed lectureship that they give every year, typically to a scholar, and it could be something in linguistics, something in arts, something in music, or just something in it's something tangential to whatever they just see as an interesting subject or an interesting speaker. And she had actually sung in a choir and had sung some of Chen Yi's choral works. So she's familiar with Chen Yi and her music and really, really adored her. So she loved the idea and took it to the donor family, and the donor family loved the idea. So this wound up being the underwriting for the entire residency. And I wound up getting some money from the College of Fine and Applied Arts through the Dorado Taft grant, mm-hmm. and some supplemental funding through HRI. But most of it was we were able to get her this endowed lectureship, which allowed for funding for her to come here for 3 days and be able to interact not only with people in the School of Music, but people throughout the College of Fine and Applied Arts. And then the whole capstone project that the department chair wanted was some sort of concert of her music.
Mm-hmm.
So the 3-day residency ended with this concert I produced, where I selected music, mostly solo and chamber works, and also a choral work of hers I love called Spring Dreams. And we put together an hour-long program with a half-hour pre-show as well, that was featured string quartet on actually a Zhou Long piece. And I was able to collaborate with a lighting designer, get some dancers to do some original choreography to some of the music, and then kind of create a showcase of her music. And for me, the programming of that concert was really important because I wanted to not only show pieces that clearly are influenced by traditional Chinese folk music or traditional Chinese instruments, but also look at pieces of hers that are very modernist sounding, that maybe aren't as influenced by her Chinese culture and heritage. So to me, that was one of the big points of the residency, was to view Chen Yi's work through this wide spectrum of subject matter, but then also look at the relationship of identity with a composer, and then see how it exists on a continuum, and how that identity can come in very overt ways, but also sometimes in ways that aren't particularly salient to most listeners, and kind of uncovering that. And then the other kind of big anchor of that residency, beyond doing some coachings and master classes, guest lectures, and rehearsing with ensembles, was I did a workshop on the piece Buy-In, where she and I were on stage having a conversation about the piece. I was able to play some of the source material for her, some of the recordings that she used, had the ensemble demos, some specific musical concepts from my research on the piece, and then we gave a performance of each movement. We would talk about it and do a performance of the movement. So that was the residency in a nutshell. It was a lot of fun.
That's so fascinating. I really love how multimedia, bringing in dancers and connecting so many departments on campus. That's just wonderful. So congrats on getting that done. And
Thank you.
So happy we were able to get Chen Yi to campus. That's fantastic. And so that happened 2 weeks ago, right? It was 2 weeks ago. Dates are so
about 2-3 weeks ago. I know it goes by so fast.
But then this week, on the concert on Friday, on the 21st, you're conducting Spring Festival, right?
Yes.
Could you talk?
So this is.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Could you talk?
No, sorry.
About yeah, soon, fun times. Could you talk a bit about kind of the more salient aspects and more significant aspects that you thought of when approaching Spring Festival?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to share a little quote that I actually included in the written program notes. And this is a quote that comes from Letta Miller's and J. Michelle Edwards' book, Chen Yi, which they are two prominent Chen Yi scholars. They wrote this book in 2020 through the University of Illinois Press. And actually, I just saw her post. I think it won an award. I forget. I don't know the name of the award off the top of my head, but just recently won an award in scholarship. I feel very lucky to have done my thesis work on Chen Yi with that book available, because it not only provided so many fantastic biographical resources and basic musical concepts of her work, but also had a really rich bibliography that then pointed me to additional Chen Yi scholars and extant literature with that. So this quote, I think, is a great summary of her approach to composition. So it says, "My approach to composition is to combine the mind and the heart together. If you combine these and speak in the most natural language, that is your own unique language. That's what a creative artist wants to have. That's also my goal. I studied Western music and Chinese music and found my natural speaking manner, so I use this kind of expression in my compositions." And that was a lot of my research, was looking at the blend of these two cultures in her music, and that's a very prominent research line with her topic. But I was interested in Buy-In, specific, looking at it from more of a liminal standpoint, a lot of times people use the word fusion to describe her music, which is, I think, valid, but I think fusion sometimes simplifies the relationship between those two cultures. Whereas yet concepts of boundarylessness and liminality, they allow for more of a spectrum or more of a continuum of how those elements, she draws from those elements, both cultures which she's very fluent in terms of musical compositional language and syntax, and how she brings those elements together. So the Spring Festival, it was written in 2002 for the Band Quest series. And the Band Quest series was a series run by the American Composers Forum to commission leading composers. Typically, many of them had prominent orchestral or chamber or solo repertoire. And some of them had some work with wind bands and wind ensembles, but specifically write a piece for younger developing ensembles. So they were looking typically at the grade 3, grade 4 range, which often is for advanced middle school to early high school, but oftentimes is music that also advanced high school and college ensembles can play and still have a very rewarding musical experience. So even though it is for a developing ensemble in intent, it to be performed by a wide range of ensembles and ability levels, because there's so many different layers to these pieces in the Band Quest series. Composers like Michael Colgrass, Michael Doherty, Brent Michael David were some of the ones that were commissioned among many other leading composers. So the piece, she uses Spring Festival is specifically the Chinese New Year or the Lunar New Year, and she uses a folk song called Line Playing with the Ball as the main melodic material. Mm-hmm. So when I was studying the piece, I found a recording on YouTube of a traditional Chinese ensemble, very high quality recording, and listened to that. And though it's not the exact melody, you can hear how the melody in Spring Festival is inspired by the Line Playing with the Ball melody. So for me, that really informed a lot of stylistic, phrasing, performance practice. But the other thing, and so that's something that's more overt, is as a reference to a traditional Chinese folk melody. Something that's a little more hidden is her use of golden section ratio when she creates the form of a piece. This is something that she has spoken about to several scholars, and it appears in a lot of scholarship about her music. She was really influenced by the work of Roy Howitt, who wrote a book called Debussy in Proportion, and she taught a class when she was on faculty briefly at Peabody in the late 90s on Debussy. So she came across this book and was really drawn to the concept of golden section and golden form and the ratio, and decided that she wanted to use this ratio a lot in her composition structures, and for the very one practical purpose that it actually makes composition go by faster because you're able to develop proportions. But the other one is that these proportions actually can occur very naturally, especially in traditional Chinese folk music. Wow. You can analyze a lot of folk songs or folk tunes and through the lens of golden section and find a lot of meaning. So the entirety of Spring Festival has a golden section moment that happens. It basically measures 1 through 45 is one section, then the golden section happens in measure 45 to measure 46. And then you hear a pretty significant climactic moment happen, and then a shift in texture and ideas. And then the second half of the piece is measures 46 through 76. But even within the first section, let's call it section A, 1 through 45, there's actually some smaller golden section ratios that happen as well. And this is something I found in Bai Yin, where she creates nestled golden sections.
Oh, that's
and layers those together. And now that's something that she writes about in the program notes, but that's something that might not necessarily be salient to the listener, because music as a temporal art, it's not like when you look at a piece of visual art and look for proportion, you can see golden section proportion. I feel like as a listener, it's harder to detect or sense a golden section moment where it's, oh yes, we're 0.68134, whatever the ratio is, through the piece. We must have hit the golden section. It's something that, you have no idea the length of the piece. So that's something that's more of a hidden structure that she uses a lot in her compositions, that golden section form. So to me, my research and seeing Chen Yi's music through the lens of things that are overt and things that are hidden helped me approach my analysis. And also just being much more comfortable with analyzing different pentatonic modes and being able to hear in those pentatonic modes as well. I think stuff that's not as familiar as someone who's trained in Western classical art music.
Right. I think it also really gets back to this idea of liminality rather than fusion, which I really love. So this concept of, liminality, of course, being when it's not necessarily one thing, but it's also not necessarily another. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
mirrors this focus on overt in terms of, these folk melodies, but also the hidden, that's structural. And so again, that's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Are these characteristics that when you were working with the ensemble you brought to their attention, or how did you integrate this knowledge into rehearsal?
Yeah. So thankfully, because of Canvas and the learning structures that we have, I was able to post not only a recording of a band playing string festival, but I shared that recording that I stumbled upon of the folk music of Lion playing with the ball. So um, we initially listened to it at the beginning of the rehearsal cycle just to provide some context and to give the ensemble a sense of what we're trying to emulate. A big part of my thesis was looking at emulation of traditional folk instruments by Western instruments, so inform performance practice. So even last week, as we've been rehearsing it, I didn't get a sense that we were really capturing the character, or there's a lot of nuance, especially with articulation and phrasing that we were, I think, missing. And so we started a rehearsal where I just played a small clip of the recording again, just to give them some recontextualization.
Mm-hmm.
Of saying that we can't approach this as a band, but we have to approach this as trying to emulate these traditional instruments. And that really changed the way that they played it that day. And I think that just helped remind them that even though this is scored for band, wind ensemble, it's not. We're not trying to play it like a wind ensemble. We should be trying to play it like the traditional instruments. Not again in terms of sound concept, but in terms of phrasing, articulation, style. We want to try to emulate that as best as we can through the vehicle of Western instrument notation. So that was a big part of it. And then I think using golden sections to help create proportion and to help create architecture. So when we do approach the golden section ratio on the macro level, then they know that's a climactic moment and not something that we just go through. But that's kind of the thing that we're aiming towards
Mm-hmm.
throughout the work. And then same with some of the smaller kind of secondary golden section moments, is that helps explain why there's orchestration shifts, or why there are texture changes in those moments as well.
Well, awesome. I am really looking forward to hearing the piece on Friday. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to have this wonderful little interview. And I hope you have a really nice day.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone comes on Friday. It's going to be a really exciting concert.